What happens when a homeless veteran's case turns into a courtroom revelation that shakes everyone to their core? As secrets of her service come to light, will justice prevail, or will she remain forgotten by the very country she served? Subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from as we uncover this inspiring tale of sacrifice, redemption, and hope. Clara Reynolds sat on a splintered park bench, the weight of her worn-out backpack resting against her feet. The bustling city moved around her, indifferent to her presence. Once she had commanded teams in high-stakes operations overseas. Now her world was confined to city blocks and nights spent searching for shelter. Her army-issued jacket, threadbare but still sturdy, bore a faded insignia that hinted at her past, a past she rarely spoke about. Her stomach growled as she watched people stroll past with coffee cups and shopping bags. Clara wasn't one to ask for help. She hadn't even put up a sign like others she had seen. It wasn't pride, exactly. It was that old military instinct to tough it out, to not draw attention. But tonight, exhaustion had won. She'd ventured onto the construction site of a luxury condominium, desperate for a safe, dry place to sleep. It was supposed to be quiet. The site had been abandoned for hours, a hulking skeleton of concrete and steel against the evening sky. Clara found a spot beneath an overhang, laying her jacket over the ground before sitting down and leaning against a cold pillar. For the first time in days, she felt a momentary flicker of relief. That peace was shattered when a flashlight beam pierced the darkness. Clara squinted, shielding her eyes. A security guard's sharp voice followed. "You're trespassing. Get out of here before I call the police." Clara stood slowly, lifting her hands to show she meant no harm. "I'm just passing through," she said, her voice even, calm. But the guard didn't waver. Moments later, red and blue lights cut through the night, and an officer stepped out of his cruiser. The officer asked for identification. Clara handed him her military ID, a piece of her past she hadn't been able to let go of. The officer studied it, his expression unreadable. "You can't stay here," he said finally. "We'll let the courts decide the rest." As the officer led her away, Clara glanced back at the half-built skyscraper. Another piece of her dignity, she thought, left behind in the rubble. The courtroom was far colder than Clara had anticipated. She adjusted her jacket, the one thing keeping her grounded, as her public defender flipped through the thin case file in front of him. The lawyer, a man no older than 30 and fresh out of law school, had introduced himself only 10 minutes earlier. He gave her a weak smile that didn't reach his eyes. To him, this case was probably just another mark on his workload. A trespassing charge with no real consequence. To Clara, it was another blow to a life already shattered. "All rise," the bailiff called, and the room rustled as everyone stood. The judge, an older man with a commanding presence, entered and sat at the bench. Clara noticed his silver-rimmed glasses and the military pin subtly affixed to his robe. It was a detail that might have gone unnoticed by others, but Clara had an eye for such things. The prosecutor wasted no time painting her as a vagrant. He described her as disruptive, citing complaints from the property owner and emphasizing her repeated infractions in the area. Clara didn't flinch as he spoke, though the words cut deep. She had grown used to people assuming the worst of her. When the judge turned to her attorney, the young man fumbled to find his footing. "Your Honor, my client is a veteran with an honorable discharge. She served multiple tours overseas and has struggled to reintegrate due to circumstances outside her control." He looked at Clara for support, but she stared straight ahead, her expression blank. The judge raised a brow. "Do you have any evidence of this service?" The lawyer hesitated, then slid a worn folder across the desk. It contained a copy of her discharge papers, along with a few old photographs that Clara had kept in her backpack. The judge picked up the papers, his face unreadable as he examined them. He lingered on one photo, a group shot of soldiers standing in front of a desert outpost, all smiling despite the exhaustion etched into their faces. Clara was in the center, her stance radiating authority. "This is compelling," the judge murmured. He looked directly at Clara for the first time. Miss Reynolds, is there anything you'd like to add? Clara swallowed hard. Only that I didn't mean any harm, Your Honor, she said, her voice low but firm. I've done my best to survive, but it hasn't been enough. The room was silent as the judge leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. The judge set the papers down with a deliberate motion. Ms. Reynolds, your military record is commendable. However, commendations don't exempt you from the law. The charges against you remain serious. Clara clenched her fists under the table. She'd expected as much, but hearing the word still felt like a blow. Her public defender leaned toward her and whispered, "Stay calm. Let me handle this." The prosecutor, sensing momentum, pressed on. Your Honor, while Miss Reynolds may have an honorable service record, the fact remains that she was trespassing on private property. The developer has been dealing with repeated incidents, and leniency here could set a dangerous precedent. The judge turned his sharp gaze to the prosecutor. We are not here to set precedents, but to deliver justice. As the exchange continued, Clara's mind drifted. She could almost feel the desert heat again, hear the faint hum of helicopters overhead. Her team had relied on her judgment to lead them through life-threatening situations, and yet, here she was, powerless in a courtroom filled with strangers. Suddenly, the young lawyer's voice broke through her thoughts. Your Honor, I'd like to request a recess to gather additional documentation that may provide further context for Ms. Reynolds' circumstances. The judge studied the defense lawyer, his expression unreadable. You've had sufficient time to prepare, Counselor. Yes, Your Honor, the lawyer replied nervously. But there's one document I only recently became aware of, and I believe it could provide clarity on Miss Reynolds' actions. Clara glanced at him, confused. She hadn't mentioned anything new to him. What was he talking about? The judge exhaled audibly, but nodded. You have 24 hours. Make sure the additional documentation is relevant. The gavel struck, and the courtroom emptied in a murmur of voices and shuffling papers. Clara remained seated, staring at her lawyer. What document? She asked quietly. The lawyer hesitated. Something I came across while reviewing your file. A classified operation. Something redacted, but I think it could help. We just need permission to access the unredacted version. Clara's chest tightened. She knew what he was referring to. It wasn't just a document. It was a piece of her life she'd tried to bury, a reminder of what had been sacrificed. And now, it might be the only thing standing between her and a criminal record. The recess had stretched into the next morning, and Clara felt every passing second weigh on her. She sat in the courtroom, her hands tightly gripping the armrests of the chair. Her lawyer entered, clutching a manila folder. He looked both nervous and determined as he approached the bench. Your Honor, the lawyer began, placing the folder carefully before the judge. This document was obtained with special permission, and while it's heavily redacted, it provides context for Ms. Reynolds' military service. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. Relevance, Counselor? The lawyer shot Clara a quick glance before addressing the judge. This document demonstrates the extraordinary pressures and sacrifices Ms. Reynolds endured, which directly contributed to her current circumstances. The judge picked up the folder and flipped through its contents. Clara couldn't see what he was reading, but she could guess. The document wasn't just a sterile record of facts. It was a fragmented story of missions executed in hostile territories. Decisions that saved lives but left scars, both seen and unseen. The room was silent except for the faint shuffle of papers as the judge read. His face betrayed little, but Clara noticed the way his fingers paused over certain sections. Finally, he looked up. Mr. Reynolds, this document paints a picture of a soldier who carried an extraordinary burden. It mentions a covert operation that involved significant personal risk. Clara's heart pounded. She nodded slowly, her throat dry. Yes, Your Honor. That mission, it was classified, and I can't speak about it in detail. The prosecutor interjected. Your Honor, While her service is admirable, this doesn't change the fact that she was trespassing. We can't allow sympathy to override the law." The judge held up a hand, silencing him. "This court doesn't deal in sympathy. We deal in justice." He turned to Clara, his gaze piercing. "Ms. Reynolds, do you believe your experiences in service contributed to your current situation?" Clara took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the room's attention. "Yes, Your Honor. I returned home different. I've struggled to find my place since then. But I've never intended to cause harm. I just needed a place to feel safe." Her voice wavered at the last word, and the courtroom seemed to pause, hanging on the emotion in her words. The judge leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "We will continue this discussion after a short recess." As the gavel struck, Clara exhaled, feeling as though she'd just stepped off a battlefield. But the war wasn't over yet. The judge's chambers were quiet except for the ticking of an ornate clock on the wall. Clara and her lawyer sat across from the judge, the tension thick in the air. This was not a standard meeting, and Clara knew it. The judge removed his glasses, setting them neatly on his desk as he folded his hands. "Miss Reynolds," he began, his tone softer than before. "What I'm about to say stays between these walls. Understood?" Clara nodded, unsure where this was going. Her lawyer looked equally uncertain, but nodded as well. The judge continued, "I reviewed the file. What isn't redacted tells a harrowing story of sacrifice, of choices most civilians would never have to make. I, too, served in the military. I understand some of the burdens you've carried." Clara's jaw tightened as she forced herself to hold his gaze. Hearing those words from someone in a position of authority, someone who might truly understand, was almost too much. "I've contacted a liaison within the Department of Veterans Affairs," the judge continued. "There's a program that can help veterans in your situation. Housing, therapy, job placement. But this isn't an offer I extend lightly. You'll need to commit to seeing it through." Clara blinked, caught off guard. She had spent so long fighting for scraps, for moments of safety, that the idea of real support felt alien. "Your Honor," she said, her voice tentative, "why would you do this for me?" The judge leaned forward, his expression serious. "Because I believe in second chances, Miss Reynolds, and because it's clear that the system failed you long before you set foot in that construction site." Clara felt a lump rise in her throat, but managed to nod. I'm willing to try." The judge nodded, satisfied. "Good. We'll reconvene in court shortly, but know this. Your case is a wake-up call for many. I intend to see it used as a way to shine a light on what veterans face after their service." Clara and her lawyer were dismissed, and as they left the chambers, her lawyer whispered, "This could change everything, Clara." Clara didn't answer immediately. She stepped into the hallway, her heart heavy with a strange mix of hope and fear. For the first time in years, it felt like a door was opening. But stepping through it would require courage of a different kind. The courage to rebuild. The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs as everyone returned from the recess. Clara sat quietly at the defense table, her hands folded in her lap. Her lawyer adjusted his tie nervously, clutching the manila folder like it was a lifeline. Across the room, the prosecutor exchanged whispers with the property developer, who looked increasingly agitated. "Arise," the bailiff called out, silencing the room. The judge entered, his expression unreadable, and took his seat. His gavel struck once. "We're back in session." The prosecutor was quick to stand. "Your Honor, while the defense has introduced compelling evidence of Ms. Reynolds' military service, I maintain that this does not excuse her actions. Trespassing is a violation of the law, and the property owner has suffered repeated disruptions as a result." The judge raised a hand, signaling the prosecutor to sit. "Understood. Counselor, your point is noted. However, the court must consider all factors, including the defendant's circumstances." He turned to Clara's lawyer. "Counselor, have you reviewed the additional document thoroughly?" "Yes, Your Honor," the lawyer replied, his voice steadier now. It provides crucial context for Ms. Reynolds' actions and her current condition. The judge nodded and motioned for him to proceed. Clara watched as her lawyer stood and began speaking. Your Honor, this document sheds light on Ms. Reynolds' service, specifically a classified operation that required extraordinary courage and left her with lasting psychological trauma. These are not just the struggles of one veteran. They reflect the systemic failures in how we support those who serve. He paused, then gestured toward Clara. My client returned to a world that didn't have a place for her. She was promised opportunities, stability, and respect, but instead she was met with indifference. This case isn't just about trespassing. It's about what happens when society turns its back on its heroes. The courtroom fell silent. Even the prosecutor looked momentarily taken aback. Clara felt the weight of the lawyer's words pressing down on her. She hadn't asked to be a symbol, hadn't wanted her life to be a statement. But here it was, laid bare for everyone to see. The judge tapped his pen against the bench thoughtfully. Ms. Reynolds, he said, his tone softer now. Would you like to address the court? Clara hesitated, then stood. Her voice was steady but low. I didn't mean to cause harm. I didn't ask for things to be this way. But I fought for this country because I believed it was worth it. I still do. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The judge leaned forward, his hands steepled under his chin, and studied Clara for what felt like an eternity. His eyes flicked back to the file on his desk, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a gravity that silenced even the faint whispers in the courtroom. Ms. Reynolds, he began, your story is one of service, sacrifice, and resilience. But as this court must operate within the bounds of the law, I am tasked with balancing justice and accountability. Clara remained standing, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She didn't know if his words were a preamble to leniency or another disappointment. The prosecutor cleared his throat, breaking the silence. Your Honor, while I acknowledge the defendant's service, the fact remains that the property owner has suffered damages. If the court allows this behavior to go unpunished, it could set a dangerous precedent. The judge gave him a sharp look. Mr. Calder, I've heard your arguments. You've made your position clear. Turning back to Clara, he gestured for her to sit. The court will now consider input from a third party. At this, Clara's lawyer looked surprised, but he quickly masked it with a nod. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and a man in a crisp navy suit entered. He walked with purpose, carrying an air of authority. Clara's breath caught when she recognized the man, Colonel Daniel Brooks, her former commanding officer. The colonel approached the bench and gave a respectful nod to the judge. Your Honor, with your permission, I'd like to speak on behalf of Ms. Reynolds. The judge motioned for him to proceed. You may. Colonel Brooks turned to face the courtroom. His voice was steady, authoritative. I served with Clara Reynolds during one of the most volatile periods of our deployment. She demonstrated exceptional leadership and bravery, often at great personal risk. I can attest to the toll those missions took on her and on all of us. He paused, looking directly at Clara. She gave everything for her country. But when the time came for her country to give back, she was met with silence. The room was utterly silent as he continued. Ms. Reynolds does not deserve punishment. She deserves the support and respect she's earned, and I urge this court to consider that when making its decision. The judge nodded, his expression thoughtful. Thank you, Colonel Brooks. Your words carry weight. As the colonel returned to his seat, Clara's eyes brimmed with tears. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen, not just for her struggles, but for the sacrifices she'd made. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs following Colonel Brooks' statement. Clara sat frozen in her chair, overwhelmed by the weight of his words. It had been years since someone spoke about her with such respect, such recognition. She dared not meet his gaze, afraid that one look would unravel the fragile composure she clung to. The judge cleared his throat, silencing the room. This testimony sheds light on Ms. Reynolds's character and the circumstances that led her here. However, we must weigh this alongside the facts of the case." He turned to the prosecutor, who rose with a smirk that grated on Clara. "Your Honor," he began, "while this testimony is compelling, it doesn't absolve the defendant of her actions. The property owner has submitted documented evidence of repeated incidents involving Ms. Reynolds. We must protect private property rights and hold individuals accountable." The judge nodded but said nothing, signaling the prosecutor to sit. Clara's lawyer stood next, a fire in his eyes that hadn't been there earlier. "Your Honor, I'd like to remind the court that the so-called damage in question consists of nothing more than a few scuffed tiles and minor trespassing. Is this really the kind of case that demands criminal charges, or are we punishing Ms. Reynolds for her circumstances?" The prosecutor scoffed, but Clara's lawyer pressed on. "Furthermore, we've just heard from Colonel Brooks, a man who risked his life alongside Ms. Reynolds. Are we to ignore his testimony about the systemic failures that brought her to this point? Is this court content to overlook the broader issues at play?" The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You've made your point, counselor." Clara's lawyer sat, his jaw tight. The judge paused, then addressed Clara directly. "Ms. Reynolds, you've heard the arguments presented here. Is there anything else you wish to say before I deliberate?" Clara rose slowly, her legs trembling beneath her. She gripped the edge of the table, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "Your Honor, I don't have an excuse for what I've done. I was just trying to survive. But I don't want pity. I want a chance to stand on my own again." The courtroom was silent as she sat down, her heart pounding in her chest. The judge's expression softened for just a moment before he straightened. "Very well," he said, tapping his gavel lightly. "I'll take all arguments under advisement. This court will reconvene in 30 minutes with my decision." The room erupted in whispers as people filed out, but Clara barely noticed. She stared straight ahead, her mind racing. 30 minutes. A lifetime compressed into half an hour. Clara sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, her hands trembling slightly as she held a paper cup of lukewarm coffee. The bustling noise around her seemed distant, muffled, as if the world had shrunk to the confines of her own mind. 30 minutes. That was all it would take to decide her fate. Colonel Brooks appeared beside her, his presence steady and grounding. "You handled yourself well in there," he said softly, his tone carrying the same authority she remembered from years ago. "No matter the outcome, you've shown strength." Clara glanced at him, unsure how to respond. She hadn't felt strong, not in years. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible. He sat down next to her, his posture upright and composed. "When I heard about your case, I knew I couldn't stay silent. You were one of the best soldiers I ever served with, Clara. I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for you." His words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. Clara looked down at her hands, struggling to hold back tears. "I didn't think anyone even remembered me," she admitted. Brooks placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We don't forget our own." Before she could reply, her lawyer approached, looking more composed than he had earlier. "The judge is ready to reconvene," he said, motioning toward the courtroom doors. Clara rose to her feet, her body tense. As she stepped back into the courtroom, the atmosphere felt heavier, more charged. The murmurs ceased as soon as the judge entered, and everyone stood in quiet respect. The judge's face was as unreadable as ever, but his eyes lingered on Clara for a moment longer than before. He adjusted his glasses and began. "This case has presented challenges that extend beyond the letter of the law. We've heard arguments from both sides, and we've considered testimony that speaks to the defendant's character and circumstances." Clara gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. She barely heard the rest of his preamble, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the words. Finally, the judge looked directly at her. "Mrs. Reynolds, this court recognizes your service and the sacrifices you've made. However, the law requires accountability. I have reached a decision that I believe balances justice with compassion." The room seemed to hold its breath as the judge continued. "The charges against you will be dismissed under the condition that you enroll in a veteran rehabilitation program. This program will provide you with housing, mental health support, and career assistance." Clara's breath hitched. Relief washed over her, mingling with disbelief. The gavel struck, and the courtroom erupted into a low hum of conversation. Clara remained seated, her mind racing to process what had just happened. For the first time in years, there was a flicker of hope. The courtroom had mostly cleared, leaving Clara sitting at the defense table in stunned silence. Her lawyer leaned toward her, a rare smile on his face. "We did it, Clara. You're free to start over." She nodded slowly, the reality of what had just happened beginning to settle in. Free. The word felt foreign, almost out of reach. For so long, she'd been trapped in survival mode, unable to think beyond the next day or the next shelter. Colonel Brooks approached, his steps deliberate and measured. "Congratulations," he said, extending a hand. Clara shook it firmly, her grip carrying the gratitude she couldn't yet put into words. "I don't know how to thank you," she said quietly, "for showing up, for speaking on my behalf." Brooks gave a small, knowing smile. "You earned this, Clara. I just reminded them of what was always true." As Clara stood, the judge exited his chambers and approached her, flanked by a court clerk. His stern expression had softened, and he held a small envelope in his hand. "Ms. Reynolds," he said, "this is a list of contacts within the Veteran Rehabilitation Program. I've made sure your case will receive priority." Clara took the envelope, her hands trembling slightly. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but thick with emotion. "I won't waste this opportunity." The judge nodded. "I have no doubt you'll make the most of it. Your story highlights how much we still need to improve in how we care for our veterans." As he walked away, Clara turned to leave the courtroom, her lawyer and Brooks trailing behind her. Outside, the crisp air hit her face, a reminder that life beyond those courthouse walls was waiting. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a brighter future. "Let's get you started," her lawyer said, gesturing toward his car. "We'll head to the program office and get your intake process underway." Clara hesitated, then smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just a small curve of her lips, but it was real. "Let's do it." As she climbed into the car, she glanced at the envelope in her hand, a tangible symbol of hope. She wasn't naive. She knew the road ahead would be challenging. But for the first time in years, it was a road she was ready to walk. In that moment, Clara felt a flicker of pride return. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was rebuilding, step by step.